Good evening, everybody. So, welcome. My name is Laurel McDonald, and I'm director of the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library. And on behalf of the U of T Libraries, I wish to welcome you to the John Seltzer and Mark Seltzer Memorial Lecture. To begin, however, I wish to acknowledge the land on which the U of T operates. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississauga. And today, this place is home to many Indigenous and Métis peoples across Turtle Island, and we're grateful for the opportunity to work on it. So thank you all for joining us for the John Seltzer and Mark Seltzer Memorial Lecture. I'm really delighted that we have Mrs. Seltzer here with us this evening, as well as her son Gareth and her daughter-in-law Monique. So thank you so much. So, as you may know, Mrs. Seltzer has just been a remarkable friend of the Fisher for so many years, and we really very much appreciate all of her support. We're especially grateful for her family's longstanding support of this lecture series that's brought so many remarkable and fascinating guest lectures to us over the years. So thank you so much. So speaking of fascinating and interesting, it's my honor to introduce you to Rebecca Romney. Rebecca is the co-founder of a rare book company called Type Punch Matrix, and she's also the co-founder of the Honey and Wax Book Collecting Prize. She's the author of several books, including the romance novel in English, A Survey in Rare Books, 1769 to 1999, and Printer's Error, Irreverent Stories from Book History, which she co-authored with J.P. Romney. Rebecca, as many of you may know, is also the long-standing book expert on the History Channel's television series Pawn Stars. And she's also a member of the Grolier Club, l'Association Internationale Bibliophilie, and also the Council of the Bibliographic Society of America. And so tonight, Rebecca will speak to us on bibliography in the wild, the obstacles and opportunities of collecting rare romance books. But before Rebecca comes up to the stage, I just wanted to remind you that as with all Friends of the Fisher lecture series, there's opportunity at the end to ask Rebecca questions. And also we are hybrid again this evening. This is the second time we're going hybrid live. And it's the first time that we'll be able to take questions from the audience as well. So if you have questions and you're watching us virtually, please don't hesitate to put them into the chat. And hopefully Rebecca will be able to answer them after her lecture. So without further ado, welcome Rebecca.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. I am very pleased to be back in Toronto. I have not been back since before 2020, and I have gotten a very warm welcome here, and I am grateful to be able to talk with you on this subject, in particular in Toronto, given its quite luminous history when it comes to romance. So today, I'm going to be talking about a collection that I put together starting personally, and then eventually it moved into my business and I sold it to a special collections library. But when I first started collecting romance novels, this was in 2016, I did it partly because I personally enjoyed reading the books as a genre, and it was something that I just had interest in, but also it was an experiment, because the genre of popular romance is known to be the only billion-dollar industry in modern publishing. It accounts for 1/4 of the entire fiction marketplace. It earns more than double its nearest competitor, which is crime and mystery, by the way. And it is essentially the single biggest market force in Anglophone publishing today. But aside from a few notable exceptions, and particularly accessibility is important here, it is poorly represented across institutional special collections as well as in rare book dealer catalogs. And this was something that I paid a lot of attention to. As a rare book dealer, I'm looking to see what dealers are responding to, because we are editors. We are, by putting things in our catalogs, we are saying, this is what's important, this is what you should pay attention to, this is what you should preserve. And yet I knew of no example of a Harlequin romance appearing in one. And that struck me as odd, because by 1983, paperback romances accounted for 40% of all paperbacks sold. So given these numbers, why were there not more examples of romance in institutional special collections, but also in the trade? So I sought to build a collection that would survey the history of romance in English, and specifically I wanted to do it from my perspective as a rare book dealer, bringing not only textual and historical analysis, but also book historical approaches, and particularly a special emphasis on how the material relates to the modern rare book market, how our marketplace responds to this material that it has not been taking seriously. And so I sought books that spoke to the heritage of the romance novel. It's much deeper and broader than is typically assumed, which might be implied, as you see from the subtitle of my book, starts in 1769. And that's even using the strictest definition of romance, which is that it has a happy ending, and that falling in love is some central aspect of the plot or a relationship. So, for example, for centuries, romance has formed a substantial part of the popular reading experiences in English, especially for women. And what that means, too, is that there's so much potential here for people who study book history. If you study, what people are reading and why and what they're responding to and what they're talking about, romance is full of potential because it's always been one of the most popular genres. And I'm going to give you a number of specific examples throughout the talk. But building a collection like this, where there aren't a lot of models and there isn't much of an existing foundation, it does bring some unexpected difficulties. And one of the most common myths of modern romance collecting is that this material is common and easy to obtain. And you can see this if you go to secondhand bookstores. You just might see, shelf after shelf of secondhand romances. However, the volume of the books available on a secondhand marketplace, in fact, belies the fundamental scarcity of individual titles. And so this is particularly the case when you're talking in a collector sense of first printing and collectible condition, decent condition. So, for example, here are the first printings of the first two Mills and Boon novels that were published in paperback format by Harlequin. We've got Hospital in Bwambo in 1957 and Hospital Corridors by Mary Burchell in 1958. So these books inaugurated not only a historic partnership in the history of romance and mass market publishing, but they also tipped the scales of Harlequin's catalog towards the genre it would come to dominate, because when Harlequin began, they were publishing a number of different genres and thrillers and things like that, and romance was just part of their stable. But Ruth Palmer at Harlequin was the first to notice that their romance reprints tended to sell better than their other titles on their annual lists, and so she began seeking more sources for this material. And in the early years, as you can see here, the chosen titles were all medical romances, and this also came through the de facto editor there of romances, who was Mary Bonnycastle. That was her preference. Paul Gresco, who wrote a history of Harlequin, notes that nearly a third of Harlequin's 1955 list was composed of medical romances by a single author, in fact, Lucy Agnes Hancock. So they needed to expand that stable. Hospital Corridors was chosen in part because it was set in Montreal, but it was published second, even though it was the first book that they asked for when they wrote to Mills and Boon requesting to reprint them. Mary Burchell is a fascinating woman. This is the pen name of Ida Cook. She was Mills and Boon's major star writer at the time. She was known for her down-to-earth settings featuring everyday women. She herself was from a lower middle-class background. She had started in journalism before she worked full-time as a romance writer. And she used the proceeds from her exceptional success as a romance writer to fund trips with her sister to Europe before World War II broke out, helping Jewish refugees escape Germany under the guise of opera-obsessed tourists. They have a great autobiography about this, by the way. Hospital Mwambo, it's set in rural West Africa, and it was written in large part from first-hand experience because Anne Vinton was trained as a nurse who lived for a number of years in Nigeria. Vinton's first novel was a medical romance set in the Gold Coast, and that was purchased by Mills and Boon as well during the rise of this genre of medical romances in the 50s. And I want to point out, too, that I call these medical romances, I don't call them nurse romances, and Hospital Mbawambo is a perfect example of this. The heroine is a doctor, and that status, in fact, drives much of the conflict of the novel. For example, when she arrives at this rural hospital, the chief there tells her that she's, quote, not useful because she's a woman. And she replies, "We do everything nowadays, fly planes, drive taxis, plow straight furrows, but Mr. David Carroll," who's the name of the chief there, "will not tolerate a woman surgeon in his hospital." So this is a 1957 medical romance. According to Joseph McAleer, the rights negotiated for the two books between Harlequin and Mills and Boon were the same, and specifically they were considered a trial, and they only negotiated for 1,000 copies in the first print run, which explains, in fact, why they are so rare today. So most of the surviving copies of this trial run are barely in reading condition at all, and beautiful copies are legitimately hard to find. So when that run sold out very quickly, Harlequin then set up a publishing schedule with Mills and Boon, and that schedule meant that they would be printing 7,500 copies of each title from there. So while many of the early Harlequins are findable, 7,500 is a very different number from 1,000. These first two titles are many, many times more scarce than their successors. And even more recent material can often lead to challenges. This can be both due to scarcity in the first printing, but also in how the current secondhand marketplace functions when you're a collector looking for it. And in fact, this is related to books that you may remember sort of seeing and dismissing because they're the things you see in school libraries when you're growing up, or I'll just show you this. So Scholastic's influential line of YA romance is called Wildfire. So my collection that I built over years, I only had 3 first printings out of the 9 total from the first 2 years of this series. Wildfire has a fascinating history in and of itself. I absolutely wanted to include it. It feels incredibly recent, and it certainly has an aesthetic that I'm sure you all are familiar with, that late 70s, early 80s. But this is a part of why the series achieved such enormous popularity. And this is sort of an interesting wave. You see a push and pull of popularity over time that you can trace when you choose a genre like this. So in the 1940s to about the 1960 or so, teen romances were really the main publishing trend that for this age group. And then they gave way to what is known now as the New Realism school of books in the 60s and 70s. So for example, think S.E. Hinton's The Outsiders. And in 1979, Scholastic stepped back into the fray of YA romances on the strength of what they were seeing the teenage readers actually start to read. And they received criticism from this, but the publishers ignored professional disregard in favor of teen consumer support. And so after Wildfire's success, which was ginormous, they launched multiple YA lines, some that you probably heard these because they were just everywhere. There was Wishing Star, Windswept, Sunfire, and then there were competitors across the board. You had Silhouette had First Love, Dell had Young Love. Of course, the main famous series is Bantam's soap opera romance series, Sweet Valley High. According to the YA scholar Michael Cart, these series and their runway commercial success signaled the rise of a new retail market for young adult books. So Wildfire represents a turning point when they said, we're going to listen to readers rather than say what reviewers are saying. And that is why this is an important book to consider, or important series to consider. One kind of book historical eye that you might bring to a series like this is examining these very cover designs that we take for granted because they seem very familiar to us. So in many of these romance series for YA markets, publishers broke from the aesthetic that was established in their adult romances, because here you see these are photographic covers. And in adult romances, you would have illustrated covers that were based on paintings. And this was a conscious marketing decision to represent the audience. There was the art director of Pocket Books explained this in 1983. This was from an interview, quote, "Women 35 and older prefer art in the fantasy realm. Younger women like it more precise. And when you get to teenagers, they like photographs." So in other words, you can tell the target age range for a romance based upon the medium used in illustrating the cover. The hunt for the Wildfire books was so frustrating because the bibliographic resources available for this series, they're garbled, the titles get misattributed, the places in the series get misattributed, the dates of publication are wrong, and they're objectively scarce in that first printing due to their sort of general baked-in ephemerality and their particular popularity. So what that means is when you're searching for this, and a lot of the searching I would do online sellers very rarely include images for this type of material. And when they do, they don't generally include an image of, say, the copyright page. I will say that these books have the blessed number line, where on the copyright page, if it goes all the way down, there's a series of numbers, and it goes all the way down to 1, that's a first printing, goes all the way down to 2, second printing, et cetera. So if you have an image of the copyright page, you can see pretty clearly. But they are not actually showing images of that in these secondhand marketplaces. And so what first printings I did include in the collection were acquired alongside a far greater number of copies that turned out not to be first. And in this, they exemplify one of the most common projects or problems for any collector, which is that reading copies are abundant, but first printings in collectible condition are not. And that observation should sound familiar to anyone who's been a book collector. And that principle of relative rarity is acknowledged in how dealers handle many types of material. But romance is a major exception to this, because sellers on the secondhand marketplace don't make the same distinctions in their romance listings as they do in other genres. And so this means, on the one hand, there's a great opportunity in the current marketplace, because you can find genuinely rare and significant first editions for the price of a used book. But it also means relying more on luck and determination than you would normally as well. So for example, for years, I looked for a first printing of Curious Wine by Catherine v. Forrest. Curious Wine is the most beloved book by Naiad Press, which was the celebrated independent publisher of lesbian books. Naiad Press was founded by Barbara Greer and her partner Donna McBride in the late 70s. Greer was a collector of lesbian material for decades before founding the press, and she was a regular reviewer of lesbian novels for The Ladder, which was a newsletter of the Daughters of Bilitis, the first civil rights association for lesbians in the US. And when The Ladder ceased publication, they worked together to found Naiad Press. Their first book came out in 1974, The Latecomer. The founding of Naiad Press is very, very important in queer history and in independent publishing history as well, because it marked a turning point in American lesbian fiction, away from the shady associations of the pulps to the affirmative in-group environment of an independent press and a highly networked community. And highly networked is the key word here, because most of the press's publications, they didn't enter into wider circulation beyond Naiad's established circles. Curious Wine, though, was the exception to this. It reached well beyond its established audience and into the mainstream, and as a result, it is the title that's remembered by many people today as the first lesbian novel that they read, including, for example, Karen Kallmaker, who Forrest actually became a mentor for later, and who is now considered essentially the queen of lesbian fiction. This book has been called, quote, the ultimate lesbian love novel, and, quote, game-changing for lesbian romance. The genre wouldn't be where it is today without it. And so obviously I had to have this for my romance collection. It was too important not to have. But the way that Naiad Press delineated first edition in their books created a lot of confusion on the secondhand marketplace. First editions, first printings in particular, they say first edition on the copyright page. That seems easy. But the way that they then went from there is, for later printings, they would just say first edition, and then they would say second printing, third printing, et cetera, and they would leave that first edition, first printing there. And so people would see that, and they'd say, okay, well, it's a first printing, ignoring all the other printings below it. A little bit of wishful thinking, I think, perhaps. But because they left that phrase there, it created these problems where I bought all of these copies, and I'm just going to point out all of these copies. And some of them, I mean, you can see this literally says 6 printing on the rear, like it's very clearly not a first edition. These were all described as first editions. They are not, before finally finding a true first edition. And my hope is that as the rare book trade and the secondhand marketplace begins to take more serious notice of post-World War II popular romance, that dealers will start to catalog books like this with proper attention and place them in their historical context properly, and also use the skill sets that they apply to other types of collecting. The marketplace has not begun to do this yet, because that material is still regarded on the whole as cheap and common. But again, one benefit of collecting romance where there's been a lag behind in other areas is that you get a bit of it's almost like seeing into the future. You can see how similar situations played out in other areas of collecting and extrapolate it to what it might mean to the future of collecting romance. So, for example, the evolution and interest of dime novels is very relevant to where romance collecting could begin moving, in part because many dime novels were romances. This is a good example here, Della's Handsome Lover by Laura Jean Libbey. This is actually, it was first published in 1891, as you can see, but this was a dime novel reprint series from the 19-teens. Popular reissue, so this was a working class romance. And you've got your proto-paperback format that anticipates our mass market publications of today, and that of course would dominate romances in the late 20th century. And Libbey, another example of a really interesting author, she was a wildly successful author of dime novel romances. She sold millions of copies in this format. Her first one came out in 1889, it was called Leonie Locke, and the reception was so successful that immediately it was copied by a bunch of other dime novel fiction writers. But working class novels in particular became one of her specialties. And you can't see it here, but on the rear of the wrappers of this, you get a lot of interesting, subtle cues about Laura Jean Libbey's reputation at the time. This is progressive era, right? And at that moment, she was famous. She was, in a way, everyone knew her. So this is a quote from the rear wrapper. Was there ever, it lists 9 women authors with Libbey at the top. Was there ever a galaxy of names representing such authors offered to the public before? The fact that the first story in the series is Miss Laura Jean Libbey's $10,000 masterpiece, which was called Kidnapped at the Altar, by the way, great dime novel title. It's a guarantee of the absolute superiority of the stories issued in this series, all of which are now on the market. And so the Heart series was published bi-monthly from 1909 until the 1920s, and it used Libbey's name as their sort of centerpiece for their branding of why you would want to buy their particular series. And I also know a lot about this series because there's a bibliography. The Edward T. LeBlanc Memorial Dime Novel Bibliography notes that there are 187 numbers in this series. And that is all significant because generally we don't have bibliographies, so we're piggybacking here on dime novels. And in many ways, too, Libbey's successful use of the dime novel format presages the strategy of category romances in the latter half of the 20th century, because these are ephemeral by design. At one period, they were plentiful, and so what you see with something like this is what begins as cheap and common can become rare and desirable, often because it was originally cheap and common, and thus overlooked for conscious preservation. And romances are also a fantastic way for book historians to study how format speaks to a book's ideal audience and expected use. Dime novel, you can see it's working class romances in a cheap format meant for working class readers. They have to be able to afford it. And then in this, they tell us about the wider book culture of the time. And so it's not just dime novels, which sort of scream their format. It's also things that we sort of take for granted. This looks like a straightforward hardcover here. This is another class-conscious romance in which the upper-class town girl leaves the city and falls in love with the farmer. And this copy, this is from Mills and Boon, and it shows many of the tactics that Mills and Boon would use in order to thrive in the mid-20th century before they joined with HARLEQUIN. So first, it's a former lending library copy. Lending libraries were the bread and butter of Mills and Boon's business through the 1950s. And in fact, they stuck fast to the hardcover format after World War II while many of their competitors were going into paperback format, specifically because they had such a lucrative market in lending libraries. But after the war, there was a decline in lending libraries, and that was a significant factor in Mills and Boon partnering with HARLEQUIN to do the paperback publishing in the late 50s and early 60s. They were essentially seeking a new way to get steady income when their core business was evolving out. But at this time, the hardcovers this era, they were called the books in brown. And this is because they were issued in brown paper bindings that were, on the one hand, meant to create uniform branding across these libraries when the jackets were removed, because that was, of course, a very typical thing to do. And so you would see all of those brown books all together, and it would create a uniform look. Oh, you just know immediately the Mills and Boon books in brown. But more specifically, that color is said to have been chosen because that brown color suffered less bleed when exposed to wet, which would be a bigger problem for these types of books that are in lending libraries that are going back and forth and back and forth. And then, of course, you have another part of Mills and Boon's strategy, which is this vivid color cover design of the dust jackets. And this also maintained a type of uniformity stylistically across these designs. And so they did it both ways, because lending libraries sometimes would keep the jackets and sometimes they wouldn't. And so they did this sort of two-pronged strategy in order to make sure that in either case, their branding stayed intact. So the format of this seemingly simple book, in fact, tells the story behind the rise of Mills and Boon romances in the 20th century. And another way to use romance collecting as a way to investigate how format affects function is to follow the fate of single titles, just as you might do with, say, The Great Gatsby or Wuthering Heights. So here is a good example of this. This is Long Ago, Far Away, Alice Lent Covert. It first appeared in the special Saturday edition of the Toronto Star Weekly in 1953. And then it went through a number of different incarnations. So to talk first about the newspaper version, the strategy of publishing entire novels in the form of newspapers goes back at least as far as the 1830s. There was an economic depression in the United States that was that publishers reacted to in part by doing what they called weeklies, which is that they would print entire novels in these huge folio sheets with the idea that therefore they could ship them or distribute them through the post at the newspaper rates, which were cheaper than book rates. And of course, they used far cheaper materials than books. And many of the earliest romances that you see in the United States, in the UK, and Australia were first published in this ephemeral format. And there's major implications to this particular strategy, because unless they were written by a particularly popular author, they often didn't ever make it into book format at all. And that means there is an entire lost library of romances that has lived only through these ephemeral publications. So by the 1950s is here, this publication you can see is still very common. And one of the things that happened in the 50s is that publishers would keep an eye on these weeklies for the best stories that then they could bring out in book form. And that's what happened with Covert's novel. So this one was snapped up immediately by a publisher named Avalon in New York, and it came out in a paperback format. And then here it was reprinted again as part of Bantam's Red Rose series in 1971, that great early 70s look with these. I kept it with a few of the other books from its series so you can see how they kind of play together. So together you can see that different versions of the same book demonstrate once again how book format is directly tied to publisher approach and target audience. And so, as in any other genre, when we look at these books, not just as texts that we say like to read, but we also look at them as historical artifacts that we seek as collectors, what we're doing is we're allowing them to reveal all sorts of information about the historical context that they were produced in. I like the Avalon nurse romances as an example of how publishers marketed books one way, but the books as objects reveal a very different story in their physical attributes. These books, you can see in that detail in the top right, they have these, it says, plastic clear jacket covers, and there's a little TM there. So they were specifically advertised to last. They had these Road Art plastic clear jacket covers, and of course they're unusual for US-based romance publishing in this era because they are hardcover rather than paperback. And they also have a number of other traits that you would see with category romances, which is to say cohesive branding. They have cohesive jacket design. They have nearly the exact same length of text across books. They have a defined theme. These are all, the series is specifically called Avalon Nurse Romances. And they also focus on the series itself rather than placing emphasis on any one author or any one title. You're meant to buy all of the ones in the series because you'll know if you like one, you'll like another. And that's a typical trait of what we call a category romance. But again, these are unusual because they are hardcover rather than paperback. And they added these plastic clear covers. They're sort of an early version of archival plastic jackets that you see in book collecting across the board now. But they speak to a strategy for selling popular fiction in hardcover that Avalon did, which is encouraging buyers to think of these as longer-term additions to their library, not the read-and-toss mass-market paperbacks. That was their way of distinguishing themselves on the marketplace. Ironically, however, these early Brodart covers, they had, you can see at the top there's sort of a line, the dark black line. These were reinforced edges where the plastic was taped to the Lifetime, that's like registered trademark Lifetime backing paper. And what happens is that those edges start sticking to the jacket in the book. So many of the copies that have these covers, they have these spots of black stickiness all across them. It looks very much like the residue you see when you have electrical tape. And those that don't, like the ones here, they tend to be pristine copies in every way, which suggests that careful storage conditions are really critical to the maintenance. They're very naturally hard to find in nice condition. But then you can see a little bit of this too in the top right-hand corner. They have these paper pattern boards. This is, you can see a little bit of the green spotted pattern in the top right. These are meant to mimic the texture of cloth bindings, but they are paper, and so it's the idea of cloth, but in fact much less expensive. And so these hardcovers are this great study in made-to-last branding combined with poor quality manufacturing that results in exactly the opposite. And so you can see there's two different messages here. And branding is another way that books can become very interesting as historical artifacts. And so I'm going to spend a decent amount of time now talking about Harlequin, because we're in Toronto, so I must. And I, in fact, had an entire section just dedicated to the rise of Harlequin, including a group of Harlequin romances in translation. And these romances are going to be very interesting. You can see how there's, again, sort of cohesive branding across these, the general white and then the vignettes, a little bit different on the French one there. So in 1974, Harlequin had begun expanding outside of English language marketplaces, and this was one prong of ambitious growth, what was led by Larry Heisey. And not every idea succeeded, but each one was so big that the successes made up for the failures, essentially, until their break with Simons & Schuster for distribution and control in the United States, which was a nightmare, but that's a few years off of this. So Harlequin's expansion and translation resulted in varying degrees of success, but overall it was a core driver of revenue. And their first international expansion came, in fact, with a temporary deal with an established publisher in West Germany, Corla Verlag, and this was 1974. So they did a trial, and then they purchased a stake in Cora. And this is important because it was an established publisher. So if you look at German publications of Harlequin, they look like established German magazines and German popular printing, and they do not look like typical Harlequins initially because they thought that marketplace has already been established. But when they went into new markets, they brought their already successful branding, thinking, we'll just keep that, we know that that works. That being said, each marketplace did have to be considered on its own terms, and there was a lot of worry. In particular, French publishers did not think that Harlequin would have any success there in the late 70s. And they said, this is a quote from Paul Grusko's book again in Harlequin, "Our women don't read these kinds of books." But Harlequin proved them wrong with a very cleverly French tagline, which was, "Harlequin books are like men. It would be too bad to try only one." So that worked very well. Harlequin was selling millions of copies in these markets and moved quickly into other countries. They went to Greece, they went to Spain, Sweden, Denmark. In '79, they expanded to Japan. And you can see here that, again, they're building on the format that works for them. The exact details would differ depending on the location, but often that they found, okay, well, we know this works, so we'll keep doing it. One of the exceptions, again, that you see here in part is you have that Japanese one on the bottom. They started doing it this way, but later on, they found success using the country's format of choice for the genre, which was manga. And so there are Harlequin mangas as well. So Larry Heisey, who pioneered this expansion, his product branding and approach were combined with the success of the romance, or the rollout of Harlequin Presents in particular in 1973, and this is what grew Harlequin into a juggernaut in the 70s. And in the late 70s, they had continued their expansion both laterally, so not only translations, but things like puzzles and film, and then also vertically. You know, they established a direct mailing list. They wanted to take control of their own distribution networks, et cetera. And here's a really good example of them at their peak. This is, I've sort of spread out here a bunch of things that came in a single press kit from 1979. And this was for potential retail locations. And what it does is it provides this time capsule of the company's last moment, essentially, before it faced serious challenge in the contemporary romance market, which was in 1980 with the rolling out of Silhouette. And so this is them at their most dominant, essentially, in the field. And the included brochure emphasizes many of the strategies that Harlequin would use to distinguish itself. So, for example, they spent millions of dollars in annual consumer advertising. They would include sample Harlequins in the purchase of things like detergent. Their idea was, well, we are trying to reach primarily, our target audience is women who are based in the home, and they are going to be going and making purchases in grocery stores and drugstores. And so instead of putting our books in bookstores, we're going to put them where we know our target audience is already going. And so if we put it right next to the detergent or with the detergent, we are going direct to our consumer. And so they also did ceaseless market research. They had special promotions. They have traffic stopping displays. They talk about the numbers that, you know, this will generate $750 per square feet per year. It's very aggressive and very confident. And you can see, too, the box plays on this theme, diamonds are forever. And that's, of course, referencing the diamond in the Harlequin logo, but also the mountains of money to be made. And this theme is extended into, you can see there's an actual pack of playing cards, which is very cool. And there are display cards that play on this, this whole theme. And one of them includes statistics like 12 to 15 turns a year, 447% increase in sales in the last 7 years. And then there's a card that lists the Harlequin books' 10 commandments for higher sales and profits, exclamation point. And they say television advertising, couponing, sampling, publicity, research. Another card has, I don't think it's here, it announces that Harlequin is, quote, clean romantic fiction with no overt sex or violence. And this is an unnamed reference to the best-selling historical romances of the era that became big in the early 70s with Avon, like The Flame and the Flower. There's also, you can see the promotional copy of The Honey is Bitter right there. That was their main title when they did promotions. So if you bought detergent, you almost certainly got The Honey is Bitter. And there's also a t-shirt in there. It's a great thing. I love this. I love this so much. So you can see that they were very serious about how they branded. They saw themselves as dominant, but in the 80s, that changed with a lot of market competition from American publishers in particular. And so this book here, The End of Innocence, is Harlequin's first book in their major new line called Super Romance, and it was an attempt to update the brand just from what we saw. This is, 1979 to 1980, and it was particularly a response to what was happening in American publishing. And interestingly, this was conceived quietly by a Harlequin executive named Fred Kerner, and it was conceived quietly because the Harlequin people were not supposed to be the ones who were working on text. That was actually Mills and Boon. Mills and Boon did the texts, and Harlequin essentially did, the branding and the distribution and all of that. And so what happened is Kerner had this great idea, but he didn't know how to bring it up, and he didn't actually get official approval to do this. But when Harlequin then starts scrambling for all the competition they're suddenly facing, that's when Kerner brings up his idea, and Kerner had it ready to roll out. So the executives were willing essentially to overlook the fact that this had been done unauthorized under their noses because they had wolves at the door. However, because the approval happened so quickly, there's a lag. This first book came out in June 1980, and the next books don't appear until November of 1981. And that's evidence of this behind-the-scenes secret creation. He was just going to do this one test run, and if it went well, then he would get everything up to muster a true rollout. But instead, because everything happened so quickly, they had a sort of stumbling rollout. So this series, by the way, another evidence of its quick rollout is its name, because Kerner described that he didn't know how to name it, and suddenly he had to come up with a name. So he said, I kept thinking it was a supersized romance, and I didn't have any idea what to call it, so I just put super romance on it. And that became the name of the series. And so all of the earliest super romances go into multiple printings, and you, again, are navigating the sea of online listings that only record a copyright, only record the title page at most. They don't do the copyright and all of that. And so putting together an early run of these would be very, very difficult. I would love to do it, and I have not been able to do it thus far. And this, in some ways, parallels the proliferation of book club editions of literary fiction, which is to say, you know, because these romance novels, they don't command high enough prices where you can make that distinction. There are so many printings available of them, but how do you know which one is right? You know, in other collecting areas, especially literary fiction, you know, book club editions are much more common than the first printing, and yet those are delineated very clearly. They're not here. But you can see, therefore, that successful branding can lead to scarcity on the book marketplace, but failed branding can also do the same. This is another one of my favorite series. It's called Finding Mr. Right. These are the first and the last titles in the series, and that's all I could find because of their scarcity. This was Avon's entry into the contemporary marketplace. They had been doing historicals before that. But it was essentially meant to stand out in the crowded marketplace by having an unusual textual innovation, which was choosing between two potential matches. And the punchy marketing word for this series was sophisticated. And it was meant to be sexy and sophisticated for big women's fiction books, but put into the packaging of the category romance. So what I was talking about of the cohesive branding across books in the paperback format. And so the heroines, they're intrepid, they're career-driven, they're confident, they're often leaders in their fields. And in fact, the first book in this series, Paper Tiger, gets meta about it. It begins with the heroine's boyfriend moving out because he's threatened by her feminism. I'm just going to quote this because it's just best as a quote. Quote, "I can't handle you and your causes. Look, you know I agree with you about women's rights. I wholly support equality of the sexes, but damn your column. Every day you have to report some new and outrageous inequity. It's your job, but my job is programming computers, and I work with a bunch of people who give me flack every day about what you write. They make jokes about it, Hillary, and they ridicule me for living with you." Well, it sounds like a you problem. Anyway. So in the end, the heroine obviously does not stay with that boyfriend, nor does she quit her job after finding love, which was a very common ending to what we called career romances. And moreover, on the last page, there's a dialogue between the happy couple talking about how the heroine doesn't want children, so it's childless by choice as well. Unfortunately, this series was a failure completely, and one of the main reasons it was a failure is because of the conflict behind the scenes about the branding. So remember that the people who conceived it wanted it to be sophisticated, but then other people at the publishers wanted it to be competing directly with category romances, so they expected it to be more baseline popular. And because of that conflict, they could never decide where to put their advertising dollars, and they couldn't make decisions because they were just having warfare behind the scenes, and that meant that they were not distributing these, and they were distributing them with conflicting messages. And so they released about a book per month from February to October. They had 9 total, and then they shuttered. And these ones, on the one hand, if you can find them, they are not bibliographically complex. They were not successful, so they generally had one printing. But then there are other books where they are hard to find because they are incredibly successful. And a good example of this is The Shunning by Beverly Lewis. This was the inspirational romance credited with jump-starting the Amish romance subgenre. This is set in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. It was a surprise hit. It was published by Bethany House, which is a Christian publisher. The vice president of marketing thought it would sell maybe 25,000 copies, and then it sold over 150,000 in the first year, millions by now. He said, quote, "It was the biggest sales projection number I've ever missed in my life," which, is easy to admit when it's on the good side. There were a few other people who came after this. It became this subgenre to the point where they were called bonnet books. There was an executive at Bethany House that said, you just slap a bonnet on the cover and you double the sales. So the other thing that is really interesting about these books is that these books started having success right at the point when Walmart started carrying Christian fiction titles more heavily. And that, in fact, sort of replays something that we see with Harlequin's own market success in targeting grocery stores and drug stores and other non-traditional distribution sites. So distribution is critical to how things are reaching the hands, right, of potential readers and what type of success that can be expected. But these are really hard to find because Bethany House did not make any distinctions in their copyright page or their title page across printings. And so you can have pictures of all of that and it makes no difference. It doesn't matter. You can't tell from that whether it's first printing. And I finally figured out, I acquired like armfuls of this book trying to figure out what makes a first printing because there are subtle changes from issue to issue to issue. And so I finally kind of comparing them all together, I noticed certain things and I could kind of compare, okay, this one starts mentioning a second book in the series, this starts mentioning other books, how do I know? Because if you go online and you're looking for these books, again, a bookseller is not going to give you this information. What I figured out was that you have to look at the back matter. So at the very end, there's a leaf that advertises Beverly Lewis's other books, and it lists the titles through Echoes in the Wind. And once I delineated, okay, this is what I'm looking for, I then contacted the publisher and compared it to their own file copy to ensure that this is right. So this is a great example of like bibliography in the wild. I am having to look at all these copies and figuring it out myself. And then the problem is, even knowing this new piece of information that I have confirmed with the publisher, no one in the secondhand marketplace knows this. And when they have a $5 listing, I'm not going to email them for a photo. I mean, most will outright refuse. As a bookseller, I can do that to another bookseller, that labor. And so you can just take a flyer and you can hope it's correct, or you're just kind of stuck. So in some of these situations, you may even have the information that you need, but it's still hard to obtain the copies. And in some cases, again, this can really work to your benefit because you start being able to recognize what you're looking for that other people don't. And this happened to me with The Flame and the Flower, which is the famous book that started the historical romance explosion in the 70s. There are certain blurbs that are only on the first printing cover that disappear in later printings, which is really important for that book because it went through literally like 100 printings. So if you have no delineation of printing or edition, that's like playing slots in Vegas. Like you're not actually going to win. You're just doing it for fun. But another example of bibliography in the wild was putting together a complete run of the romances issued by Odyssey Books. This was one of the most difficult projects that I've attempted in my romance collecting, but it was also one of the most satisfying because of that difficulty. So these were published by a Black-owned small press based in Silver Spring, which is a suburb of Washington, D.C., where I live. So this is something that was very personal to me. I was really excited to try to find these because I felt like this is something I could do to honor my town. And the important thing about Odyssey Press, you can see the dates here, 1990, 1993. This was the main venue for publishing Black romances in the era before Arabesque, which was the first Black romance line from a major publisher. And it was small presses like this that sought to meet the market demand for Black romances that the major publishers were not meeting. And so this press issued books by veterans like Sandra Kitt, Barbara Stevens, but it also published the first books of a number of authors who would go on to distinguished careers with major publishers before those companies were willing to take these writers on. So, for example, Rochelle Allers, Donna Hill, Ebony Snow, Frances Ray, all of them would publish books later with Arabesque, and they got their start with Odyssey. But this is an indie press. They had a limited distribution system and a small output. And so the footprint of Odyssey Books is pretty much unremarked upon in romance history. And that makes sense because these books are rarely available in university special collections for study. So, for example, one of the books in this collection is A Chic Spell by Ebony Snow. And I wasn't looking for A Chic Spell in particular. I was looking for it because it was an Odyssey Press book. But when I got it, I was thinking about it. I'm like, a chic spell, this is a chic romance, published in 1992. So chic romance is a subgenre that was popularized by E.M. Hull's spectacularly successful 1919 romance, The Chic. You all probably have heard about it because of the landmark film. That's how most people know it today. But chic romances have been very, very popular in the 20th century, and they are also often very problematic because they tend to fetishize Orientalism in a structure that feels safe for white readers. But particularly given the racial dynamics at play here, a chic romance with an African-American heroine is unusual and has different dynamics. And I knew this before I saw this book because I had read a book called Desert Passions, which is a great title, Desert Passions, Orientalism and Romance Novels by the scholar Xu-Ming Teo. And Teo states in this book very clearly the first chic romance with an African-American heroine does not appear until 2002. That's Brenda Jackson's Delaney's Desert Chic. And here is the small press book 10 years earlier from 1992. And this is an African-American research science heroine chic romance. And it is just something that we didn't even know existed. So this gotcha is not meant to denigrate Teo's research. I love Teo's book, Desert Passions. It's one of my favorite in romance publishing. Scholars, moreover, they cannot do work like Teo's, and they cannot do accurate work unless they can have things available and accessible to study. Teo was relying on what was available for her to study. These books were not known at all. And that gets to one of the main things that I really value about the act of collecting. When we're talking about examples like this one, which is, say, Black romances here in particular, but this applies in broader communities of marginalized or underrepresented creators and readers, these are the narratives that are more likely to be buried in the official documents, in the grand histories, in the publisher's anniversary fetes. And so collecting is a strategy to search beyond the dominant narratives, even or maybe even especially when you're not entirely sure what you're looking for. And that's what happened with Ebony Snow. I wasn't thinking to look for that. And this is a critical role. That is, collectors can uncover these narratives by finding the material that's been buried. So collecting is not just acquisition, collecting is discovery. And it can also be the embodiment of memory work. Collectors are engaging in a wider cultural act of memory preservation. And what that means is collectors are part of deciding what gets to be remembered and why. And so one of the reasons the Odyssey books were so hard to collect is that there's been so little written about them. So I had to figure out the exact bibliography from scratch through collecting them. And when you're doing that, you're looking at the ads within it to see what other titles have been published and so on and so on. But why has there been so little written about them? Because they were not widely distributed, they weren't produced in great numbers, and so they often didn't end up in places where researchers, critics, and historians would access them for study. And so I used collecting to establish the bibliography of the press. And you can see how, therefore, collectors themselves play a key role in the world of rare books. And as a reminder, many of the great rare book institutions in the Anglophone world were started from the seed of a private collector's donated library. And these are the institutions that are the foundation to our access to the sources we use to understand history. So this is the vital sequence. If material is not accessible to researchers, it can't be studied. If it's not studied, it can't be included in the histories the scholars published. And if it isn't included in these histories, then readers will not even know it existed in the first place. And so the work of community memory needs collectors. And collecting in a category without many existing resources has been tough, but those challenges for me have made the successes all the sweeter. And that is the end of my talk. The last thing I'm going to add while I have the mic for questions is I have these 3 copies. Catherine Forrest is a Canadian-born author, great lesbian romance. If anyone wants these are up for grabs. So please come and get one of the great 20th century lesbian romances. And with that, we can do questions.